She stood in the doorway of the small camp clinic, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The light was fading across the grounds of the American POW camp, stretching long shadows over the wooden floor. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper bandages. Outside, the wind carried the distant murmur of guards changing shifts. And in the middle of it all was a young Japanese woman, barely in her 20s, trembling as though the earth itself had tilted beneath her feet. She had survived the firestorms of the Pacific. She had endured hunger, humiliation, and the terrible uncertainty of captivity. Yet nothing had frightened her as deeply as the sight of that simple metal sign above the door. A clinic, a place of healing. But for her, a place of the unknown. She had no word in her heart for gynecology. No memory of ever being examined by a physician for anything related to womanhood. In her village back in Japan, such things were whispered about, if mentioned at all. A woman's pain was expected. A woman's silence was demanded. And now, under the authority of her former enemy, she was asked to step into a room where a man, an American man, would examine her in a way she could not even imagine. Fear takes many forms. Compassion does too. The doctor saw her hesitation before she spoke a single word. He had been treating soldiers long enough to recognize the quiet tremor in a patient's breath. The way the eyes dart between escape and surrender. The way a person tries to hold dignity together with nothing but sheer willpower. He did not raise his voice. He did not hurry her. He simply stepped forward and offered a gentle nod toward the long bench by the wall. "You can go last today," he said. "No pressure. No rush. We'll take our time." It was a small gesture, a change in the order of patience, but in that moment it crossed centuries of cultural distance. American medical practice meeting the unspoken boundaries of Japanese womanhood. Modern clinical science brushing against generations of silence. Some said it never happened this way. Some said it was just a story passed around the barracks. A tale of a Japanese girl who fainted at the very idea of an exam, and a soft-spoken doctor who helped her understand the world in a different light. Maybe it didn't happen exactly as the soldiers told it. But there is a truth inside every story they kept. Because behind every rumor, every fragment, every whispered memory of that war, there were human beings trying to navigate the wreckage of two nations' distrust. And there were Americans, everyday ordinary Americans, who believed that even in a time of global conflict, a person deserved dignity simply because she was human. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between myth and memory. Women captured by American forces were rare. The U.S. Medical Corps followed strict protocols. And under the Geneva Convention, even an enemy combatant was entitled to proper care. But the heart of the story, the fear of a young woman confronting a world she had never known, and the American doctor who met that fear with patience instead of power, feels real enough to belong to history. And before we go deeper into this journey, this human story shaped by war, culture, and unexpected compassion, I'd like to invite you to join us for more documentaries like this one. If you're moved by stories that honor courage, humanity, and the quieter moments of World War II, consider subscribing. It helps preserve these memories and bring more forgotten voices to light. Now, let us return to that doorway where a frightened young woman waited for the sun to go down, and a doctor prepared to show her that even in wartime, mercy had not disappeared from the world. The war that carried her across the ocean was unlike anything the Pacific had seen before. It was a conflict fueled not only by weapons and strategy, but by deep cultural distance. A distance wide enough to swallow understanding whole. America and Imperial Japan entered the 1940s with worldviews shaped by different centuries. One stood on a foundation of individualism, scientific reasoning, and an emerging belief in women's autonomy. The other held tight to a rigid hierarchy where duty outweighed self, and where women often lived in the quiet shadows of obedience. In rural Japan, womanhood was a subject wrapped in silence. A young girl learned her place early, kept her questions to herself, and rarely saw a doctor unless she was gravely ill. Matters of the female body were considered private to the point of invisibility. Even basic reproductive health was rarely spoken of, much less medically examined. The idea of a routine pelvic exam belonged to a world that did not yet exist for her. The United States, however, approached the human body differently. By the 1930s and early 1940s, American medicine was already embracing specialized fields, including women's health. The U.S. Army Medical Department trained its personnel to follow strict clinical protocols regardless of a patient's gender, rank, or nationality. Inside American hospitals and military clinics, science was the compass, not shame or tradition. But out in the Pacific, far from any sterile ward, this contrast turned into misunderstanding, fear, and in some cases tragedy. Japanese soldiers sometimes viewed surrender as shameful. Women caught in the chaos of collapsing front lines faced situations that defied imagination. Many vanished into the fog of retreat. A few, very few, fell into American hands alive. That is how the young woman of our story arrived at a U.S. POW camp on the mainland, a rarity among rarities. Her capture was accidental, a product of panic on a crumbling island outpost. She worked as a communications aide, trained not for combat but for the quiet handling of coded messages. When the Americans overran the small installation, she had nowhere to run. Exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified, she surrendered with hands trembling like leaves in a storm. Transporting her to the United States was unexpected even for the soldiers who found her. Most POWs remained in island stockades, but overcrowding, illness, and logistical strain meant some were moved to larger, more stable camps across the Pacific and into the American heartland. Places like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin or Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, facilities surrounded by barbed wire, but run with a discipline that surprised many who arrived there. Life in these camps was not easy, but compared to the brutality unfolding elsewhere in the world, they followed a structure that bordered on humane. Prisoners lived under clear rules, received regular meals, and had access to medical attention. The U.S. Army Medical Corps maintained clinics staffed by doctors who treated wounds, infections, and illnesses without regard to which flag the patient once fought under. For the young woman, this was disorienting kindness. She had expected punishment or indifference, not orderly lines of POWs receiving medical checkups. She had expected interrogation, not a file created for her well-being. And yet, buried beneath her confusion was something she could not ignore. A dull, persistent ache low in her abdomen, one that had worsened over weeks. At first she tried to hide it. Pain was nothing new to her. Women in her village endured far worse without complaint. But the symptoms did not fade. They grew sharper, disrupting her sleep, twisting her into uneasy silence during meals. The guards noticed her slowing pace during roll call. A fellow prisoner, older and once a merchant sailor, quietly told a medical orderly that the girl was unwell. In an American camp, that was enough. She was escorted, gently though she felt no gentleness in the moment, to the medical wing. A place with white sheets, metal instruments, and steady voices speaking a language she barely understood. A place dedicated to procedures she could not yet imagine. She did not know the doctor who waited inside. She did not know the words written on the folder bearing her name. She did not even know how to explain what hurt. She only knew she had stepped into a world where sickness blurred the lines between nations, where even the enemy was allowed to be human again. War divides nations. But sickness makes all of us human again. And so her fate, guided by pain, fear, and a quiet hope that she tried not to admit, carried her toward the clinic doorway that would change her life, and the life of the doctor who would soon meet her trembling eyes with an unexpected tenderness. She had come from a place where mountains held the sky and rice fields shaped the rhythm of life. In that small rural village in Japan, her childhood moved quietly between seasons. Spring plantings, summer storms, autumn harvests, and long, cold winters that forced families to huddle around a single brazier for warmth. Her parents were poor, but they carried their poverty with a resigned dignity common in those years. Every morning, her father bowed in silence before leaving for the fields, and every evening her mother reminded her, gently but firmly, that a daughter lived not for herself, but for the harmony of the family. In that world, decisions were not hers to make. A girl learned to lower her eyes when men spoke. She learned to swallow discomfort, to hide pain, to pretend that her body made no demands. Illness was managed with herbs, whispered prayers, or the slow passing of time. If a woman suffered in ways tied to childbirth or the mysteries of her own anatomy, she endured quietly as her mother had, and her grandmother before her. The very idea of a doctor examining a woman, truly examining her, was so taboo it lived beyond imagination. Her education ended early. She learned to read simple texts, enough to write her name and understand household documents, but nothing more. When soldiers began appearing in the village before the war expanded, She watched them with curiosity and fear, feeling the tension between duty and dread rise across the landscape. Japan was mobilizing. Families whispered about the emperor, sacrifice, and the nation's destiny. Young men left for the front. Younger boys prepared to follow. And girls like her were told to serve in quieter ways. So when the call came to support the military as a communications aid, sorting coded messages, relaying signals, delivering written updates, she accepted, though acceptance was too generous a word. It was expectation more than choice, obligation more than opportunity. Her mother cried the night before she left. Her father did not. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder and told her, "Serve with honor and come home." But home was not in her future. The outpost where she worked was small, isolated, and held together by crumbling morale. She spent her days inside a dim room where radio static filled the air and the smell of ink clung to her fingertips. She learned the strict formality of military speech. She learned to bow to every male superior, no matter how young or impatient. She learned to survive within a hierarchy that left women voiceless, invisible except when scolded for errors. And then came the day American forces surrounded the installation. The chaos swallowed everything at once. Shouts in Japanese, explosions in the distance, the sound of boots slamming against wooden floors as officers barked orders no one could follow. She hid under a table when the walls shook. A soldier grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the courtyard, yelling at her to run, but the path was already blocked. The world spun into panic and dust and the thunder of surrender. She was captured sitting in the dirt, stunned, unable to move. From that moment forward, every authority figure she encountered was a man. American, foreign, unfamiliar. They spoke in tones she could not decipher. They moved with confidence she did not recognize. Even when they treated her with restraint, she felt exposed under their gaze. Her entire life had taught her to fear men who held power. Now she was surrounded by nothing else. By the time she arrived at the POW camp, her mind lived in a constant tremor. Her body obeyed commands automatically, but fear curled inside her like a second heartbeat. She avoided looking directly at guards. She kept her head lowered at roll call. She stayed close to fences and walls, places where she could feel something solid behind her. And then the pain began, slow at first like a quiet stitch in her side. She tried to ignore it, tried to bury it the way she had buried so many other discomforts. But it grew sharper, more insistent, breaking through her stoic silence with each passing day. She knew she needed help. She also knew that help meant stepping into a room with a man who would ask questions she could not answer, who might ask her to expose parts of herself she had been taught to guard with fear and shame. The battle inside her grew heavier than anything she had faced before. Survival pulled her toward the clinic, culture pushed her away. Honor told her to endure the pain, instinct begged her to escape it. The enemy had become her healer, and that contradiction shook her more deeply than the capture itself. She had survived bombings, hunger, and fear. But nothing frightened her more than the unknown kindness of an enemy. And as she stood there, clutching her stomach and her dignity in equal measure, she realized that the next steps she took would determine far more than whether her pain ended. They would determine whether she could trust, just once, something beyond the world that had shaped her. The pain had been tightening in her lower belly for 3 nights, slow at first, then sharp enough to make each step feel like a punishment. She tried to endure it the way she had been raised to: silence is dignity, endurance is virtue. But when her vision blurred and her knees buckled in the yard, one of the guards finally noticed. He motioned for her to follow him to the camp clinic, and she obeyed because the alternative was collapsing right there on the dirt. It was the first real medical room she had ever entered. Bright white light hummed overhead. The smell of antiseptic bit at her nose. Metal trays gleamed with a cleanliness she did not know how to interpret. Safety or threat, mercy or humiliation. The American doctor looked up from his notes when she stepped in. He didn't need a translator to see what was wrong. She was half-folded, one hand pressed tight to her abdomen, her face locked in a grimace she tried and failed to hide. He murmured to himself as he watched her posture. Could be an infection. Malnutrition. Maybe both. Then he gently asked her questions through the interpreter. She answered with small nods, small shakes of the head, every gesture cautious, rehearsed, and terrified. She was not used to men asking about her pain. She was not used to anyone asking about it at all. The doctor knew what he needed to do next. A proper examination. a closer look at the source of the pain. But he also knew what that meant for her. A Japanese woman raised in a culture where a man examining her body was almost unthinkable. He could already feel the tension thickening the air around her. When she turned and saw the anatomical posters on the wall, diagrams of pelvises, sketches of internal organs, panic hit her like a sudden wave. She froze in the doorway, feet planted, breath shallow. Her eyes snapped from the drawings to the metal instruments on the counter, then to the doctor himself. In her mind, none of it made sense. In her mind, she had walked into the place where shame lived. She stepped back until her shoulders hit the wall. Her fingers tightened around the cloth of her uniform. The room seemed to shrink around her, crowding her with images she didn't understand but feared instinctively. She whispered something, too soft to catch, but the translator didn't need to repeat it. Her meaning was clear. She thought something terrible was about to happen. The doctor stopped what he was doing. He had seen this look before, but never in a woman from an enemy nation. The wide, trembling eyes. The way she held her breath to keep herself from crying. He had seen it in young American soldiers bleeding on stretchers. He had seen it in French villagers who had lost everything. And now, here it was again, in someone who had been taught her whole life to fear men like him. He lowered his clipboard. For a moment, the room softened, the buzz of the lights dimmed, and war felt very far away. He spoke quietly to the translator. A short instruction. A simple adjustment. She would be examined last, after the other patients, after the room had emptied, so she wouldn't have to endure the stares of the men waiting behind her, or the pressure of rushing through something she barely understood. It wasn't much. It didn't solve her pain. It didn't erase her fear. But it was something human. And sometimes, as he had learned in Europe, in the Pacific, in every corner of this war, mercy was the only medicine he could offer. He watched her settle into a corner of the clinic, still shaken, still gripping the sleeve of her uniform as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. The other patients were called in and treated one by one, giving her time to breathe, to understand that nothing terrible was happening behind those doors. And as the clinic slowly emptied, the doctor felt an old memory rise, one he carried quietly, almost privately, beneath the uniform in the rank. He hadn't grown up in a place where fear was loud. He came from a small town in the Midwest, where winters were long, neighbors shoveled each other's porches without being asked, and people believed in the simple idea that you did what was right even when no one was watching. His mother had died young, taken by a gynecological infection no one caught in time. Back then, healthcare in rural America was thin and scattered. A single misdiagnosis could mean the end of a life. He had seen firsthand what silence and shame could do to a woman's body. Maybe that was why he joined the Army Medical Corps. Maybe that was why he believed, deep down, unshakably, that medicine had to stand higher than flags, borders, and uniforms. He used to say that disease didn't care about nationality, compassion shouldn't either. His colleagues joked that he treated the Geneva Convention as if it were a sacred text. He didn't mind. Rules meant humanity had boundaries. Principles meant war couldn't take everything away. When the last soldier left and the clinic door clicked shut, he stepped toward the young woman again. This time his voice softened. He invited her into his small office, a cramped space with faded charts and a single wooden chair. The translator stayed near the door, giving her distance but still ready to help. She sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't raise her eyes. The doctor took a seat opposite her, leaning forward just enough to seem present, not overpowering. He explained, slowly, gently, why her pain mattered. Why reproductive health wasn't shameful. Why infection, if untreated, could turn dangerous. He used the simplest words he could, avoiding medical jargon, avoiding anything that might frighten her further. Every sentence was quietly measured. Every pause gave her room to breathe. She listened without interrupting. Her shoulders stayed tight, but her gaze softened bit by bit as she realized he wasn't scolding, wasn't judging, wasn't demanding anything from her. He was simply telling the truth in a way she could bear to hear it. The moment felt strangely delicate, like the whole room was hanging on the thin thread of trust she hadn't fully given him yet. Then he made the gesture that would stay with her long after the war ended. "You will be the last patient today," he said. "No rush. No eyes watching. Only care." The translator repeated the words and something shifted in her posture, something small but unmistakable. Relief. Not full trust, not yet, but relief enough to let her exhale for the first time in hours. He didn't touch her. He didn't even reach for his tools. Instead, he let silence settle comfortably between them, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but safe. The kind that said, "You matter. Your pain matters. You are not an enemy in this room." The Army Medical Department had records of doctors like him, men who believed in the American idea that science and humanity belonged together. Men who treated POWs not because they were ordered to, but because healing was the one act of peace they could still control. He lived by a simple philosophy, one he rarely spoke out loud but carried like a pulse beneath his coat. To heal someone you must first make them feel safe. And that was what he offered her now, not just treatment but dignity. Not just a diagnosis but the reassurance that for the next hour she was not a prisoner, not a foreigner, not a symbol of war. She was simply a patient. And he was simply a doctor. The sun had begun to slip behind the barracks by the time the clinic grew quiet. The sharp angles of afternoon light softened into amber, and the long shadows across the floor made the room feel less like a military facility and more like a temporary sanctuary. Outside, the camp settled into its evening rhythm. Boots on gravel, distant chatter, the clang of the mess hall bell. But here, inside the doctor's small office, the world felt strangely still. It was just the two of them now. She stood near the doorway at first, uncertain whether she should enter without being told. He gestured gently toward the chair, and after a long hesitation she stepped forward and sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The pain in her abdomen flickered again, but it wasn't the pain holding her in place. It was the unfamiliar sense that she was, for the moment, safe. The doctor didn't begin with instruments. He didn't reach for gloves or charts. Instead, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small wooden model he sometimes used to teach young medics. Anatomy simplified, almost childlike in its lack of detail. No curves, no features, nothing that suggested gender or intimacy. Just a body, abstract and neutral. He set it on the desk between them. Through the translator he explained that this was simply a way to show her what was happening inside her own abdomen. Nothing more. He pointed to the lower section of the model, tracing the shape of the pelvis, describing infection the way one might describe a fire slowly growing behind a closed door. Calm. Precise. Completely detached from anything that could humiliate her. He spoke about the human body as if it were a shared language, one that didn't care about borders, uniforms, or the endless chain of commands outside the clinic walls. The words he used were clinical but never cold. He talked about tissue, vessels, inflammation, the importance of early treatment. Not once did he refer to her as a woman. He referred to her as a person with a body that needed care. And somewhere in that gentle, steady explanation, something in her chest loosened. She had grown up in a world where men didn't explain things to women, only ordered, judged, or corrected them. Where the female body was a secret, sometimes a burden, often a subject of shame. No one had ever described her biology to her with respect. No one had ever spoken about her health as if it mattered beyond her usefulness. But here he was, an American, a soldier, an enemy, talking to her as though her pain was not only valid but important. As though her well-being was something he genuinely wished to protect. She looked at him fully for the first time, and what she saw was not dominance, not power, not the threat she had imagined. She saw concentration, professionalism, a quiet sincerity she did not know how to name. And that was the moment, the nearly invisible, almost fragile shift, when fear gave way to trust. The examination that followed was nothing like the nightmare she had built in her mind. He waited until she nodded, until she steadied her breathing, until she understood exactly what he would do. Every step was announced before he took it. Every gesture was deliberate, gentle, and respectful. The translator spoke only when needed. Otherwise, silence filled the room, calm and unbroken. She expected pain, but there was none. She expected shame, but it never came. She expected to feel small, but instead she felt, strangely, unexpectedly, human. When he finished, he stepped away and gave her space, letting her sit up slowly at her own pace. She pressed her hands to her knees, grounding herself, still absorbing the fact that nothing terrible had happened. Nothing she had feared had proven true. Through the interpreter he told her the diagnosis, an infection he could treat, something manageable, something that would heal. He explained the medicine he would give her, how to take it, what signs to watch for. She listened. She nodded. And then, very quietly, she whispered thank you in a voice so soft it barely reached the air between them. The doctor didn't smile, but his eyes softened. He simply replied, You're safe here. That's all that matters. And in that dim room, touched by the last light of evening, the truth settled into her like a warm ember. For the first time in her life, she felt seen not as property but as a person. The room felt different after the exam, lighter somehow, as if a storm had passed without leaving destruction behind. She rose slowly from the chair, steadying herself, and then did something the doctor did not expect. She bowed. Not a small nod of acknowledgement, not the guarded dip she had given the guards or camp officers before. She bowed deeply, fully, with intention. To bow that way to a foreign man, an American soldier, was something she never imagined she would do. But gratitude has a gravity of its own, and in that moment she let it pull her forward. She wasn't thanking a uniform or a nation. She was thanking the one person who had treated her pain as something worthy of attention, the one person who had shown her dignity in a place built for prisoners. When she straightened, her eyes were steady in a way they hadn't been since she first arrived. The trembling was gone. The shame had thinned into something softer, something closer to relief. In the days that followed, the medicine began to ease her pain, and with the pain gone, a new clarity emerged. One evening, after helping sweep the yard with other POWs, she asked the translator if she could speak to the doctor again. Not for treatment this time, but for something she had never asked of anyone before. She wanted to learn. Just the basics, she insisted. Just enough to understand what had happened to her body, enough to know how to prevent suffering, hers or anyone else's. The idea startled the translator, but the doctor didn't hesitate. He nodded once, almost with a quiet pride, and arranged for her to come by after clinic hours. The first lesson was simple. He showed her how to wash medical instruments, how to identify common medicines, how to recognize the early signs of infection. She repeated every English word he offered, testing the sounds on her tongue, determined not to get them wrong. As the weeks passed, those lessons grew into a routine. When the last patient left, she would slip into the clinic with a notebook made from scrap paper. He would teach her anatomy using the same neutral wooden model, sketch diagrams when words failed, demonstrate the basics of hygiene, bandaging, temperature taking. She learned quickly, faster than he expected, faster than she believed she could. It was never sentimental, never emotional. Whatever formed between them was built on something quieter than affection and firmer than sympathy. It was respect, unadorned, unembellished, grounded in the simple understanding that two people can meet in the space between cultures and still see each other clearly. She respected him for giving her the knowledge she had been denied her whole life. He respected her for the courage it took to learn in a place where fear could have easily silenced her. There were no rumors, no stolen glances, no whispered feelings. Just patient instruction and earnest curiosity. Sometimes, as she practiced wrapping a bandage or labeling a vial, he would watch her with a thoughtful stillness. He knew she might never use these skills outside the camp. He knew the war could scatter them to opposite ends of the world. But he also knew something else, something simple and profoundly human. Kindness once given never stays small. What he had offered her in that first quiet evening, the respect, the patience, the safety, had grown into something neither of them had expected. The beginning of her belief that knowledge could be hers, that healing could be her calling, that dignity was not determined by nation or gender. A small act, a quiet gesture, a single hour in an empty clinic. Yet its impact would reach far beyond the wire fences and guard towers of the camp. The war ended quietly in the night skies over Japan. The surrender was announced, and across the Pacific, flags were lowered, troops discharged, and the once impregnable divisions between nations began to shift. For the young woman, the world outside the camp gates suddenly demanded decisions she had never been trained to make. She was offered repatriation, the chance to return to the land of her birth, to the familiar rice fields, the small wooden houses, and the weight of obligations she had known all her life. But she hesitated. The war had stripped her of comfort, of certainty, of childhood, but it had also revealed something she had never imagined, the possibility of choice. In the quiet evenings at the clinic, the lessons she had learned, the patience and respect shown by the doctor, had planted a seed of ambition and a vision of a life she could shape herself. She wanted to stay, not for comfort, not for ease, but to pursue knowledge that had been denied to her for 20 years. She wanted to study women's health, to understand the human body, to prevent the suffering she had endured from touching another life. With the quiet encouragement of her doctor, she applied to a medical training program in the United States. The post-war period, aided by the GI Bill and a growing recognition of women's professional potential, opened doors that had once been locked by both war and culture. She was accepted, and her days quickly filled with textbooks, lectures, and laboratory practice. Every lesson reminded her of the quiet evenings in the camp clinic, of the wooden model, of the hands that had guided her without pressure or judgment. Her focus and determination were remarkable. She excelled in the nascent field of women's reproductive health, mastering not only theory but the patient care practices that her teacher had impressed upon her. When she graduated, she chose not to return to Japan, not because she rejected her homeland, but because she had found a new home in the principles that had been quietly shown to her: respect, patience, and compassion. Over the decades, she dedicated herself to serving immigrant communities across the United States, particularly women from Asia who struggled with access to healthcare, language barriers, and cultural misunderstandings. She built clinics, offered workshops, and mentored young women in the very knowledge she had fought so hard to acquire. She became a living testament to the idea that one life touched by empathy could ripple outward, transforming countless others in ways both subtle and profound. And through it all, she carried the memory of that first American doctor, the man who had chosen patience over authority, humanity over fear, and dignity over hierarchy. He had shown her that care and respect were not privileges, but rights, and that even in the harshest circumstances, the simplest acts of kindness could change the trajectory of a life. Sometimes, the most American thing a person can do is choose compassion over fear. In the quiet corners of her later life, when students asked about her inspiration, she would tell them stories not of battles or victories, but of that tiny room in a POW camp, a small wooden model, and the patient hands that had guided her first steps into knowledge. The legacy was clear. In a world fractured by war, the principles of human decency endured, and America had shown her that the measure of a nation could be found in how it treated even the most vulnerable of strangers. The war had left scars on every corner of the world, but inside that small clinic, a different kind of story was quietly written. Violence and destruction had carved valleys of fear and loss, yet even amid the chaos, acts of humanity endured, small and luminous against the darkness. She had come to that door trembling, uncertain of what awaited her, and yet it was through that very threshold that she first encountered care without conditions, attention without judgment, and respect without expectation. Years later, she would still remember the hum of the fluorescent lights, the antiseptic scent, and the faint creak of the wooden floor under her feet. She remembered the fear that coiled in her stomach, the rapid beating of her heart, and the way the doctor's calm presence allowed her to breathe again. That room had been more than a medical office. It had been a sanctuary, a place where the rules of war softened under the quiet power of human compassion. For American viewers, the story carries a weight that is both proud and nostalgic. It speaks to a nation at war, yet capable of deep empathy. It reminds us that courage is not only measured in battlefields and strategic victories but in the patience, dignity, and gentleness we extend to others, friend or foe alike. In a world consumed by conflict, he chose to be gentle. Decades passed, and the young woman's journey carried her far beyond the camp fences. She became a trusted guide for hundreds of immigrant women navigating unfamiliar healthcare systems, helping them understand their bodies, their rights, and the power of knowledge. Clinics she helped establish bore her fingerprints: careful attention to dignity, respect for privacy, and a steadfast commitment to teaching rather than commanding. Every patient who left with confidence and understanding was a ripple of the kindness first extended to her in that quiet clinic room. The doctor returned home to the Midwest, to the small town where winters were long and people believed in quiet decency. He was remembered not for medals or rank, but for his unwavering dedication to the principles of his profession. Colleagues spoke of him in reverent tones: a man who valued human life above paperwork, compassion above hierarchy, and patience above expedience. In the annals of war, his name might not be famous, but in the lives he touched, it became indelible. Their story reminds us that the greatest victories are not always measured in miles or enemy losses. They are measured in moments where courage meets care, where patience meets fear, and where one person chooses to see another as fully human. In a country often defined by its strength and innovation, this story whispers a quieter truth: that the enduring power of America lies in its capacity for compassion. And so, in the memory of a trembling woman and a steadfast doctor, we are reminded that acts of kindness are not small, They carry the weight of legacy, the pulse of hope, and the promise of a better world. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest.